So in this module, we'll first take a look at how we can send text messages from the client to the server. And then in a later part of the module, we'll take a look at how we can send binary messages. We'll also take a look at the two ways we can handle messages, whole messages and partial messages. Partial messages become important when we're handling binary messages, as the size of the message can be so large. So as we are writing a chat application, we'll add a chat endpoint. And this is simply a new Java class called chat endpoint. And we know that this class needs to be annotated to make it a server endpoint. So we'll add the server endpoint annotation to this. The server endpoint annotation, we need to specify the URL of this endpoint. So that will be /websocket/chat. We then have choices as to how we implement the endpoint. We could go ahead here and implement the message handler interface, message handler.whole in this case, for a string. And that makes this server endpoint both an endpoint and a message handler. And that's a fairly standard practice when we write Java WebSockets. However, we won't implement the interface directly. Instead, what we'll do is we'll use the annotations to add message handlers to this class. And we'll add a text handler in this part of the module, and then later we'll add a binary handler to show that we can add both text and binary handlers to the same endpoint, and also to show that we can use whole and partial handlers within the same endpoint. So for this, before we implement the message handler, we'll add an open method. So we'll have a public void onOpen, and this will allow us to handle socket opens, and this will be annotated with an onOpen annotation to say that this is our open method. The open method, if you remember, is passed a session, which we will make use of, and an endpoint config, which we won't. So I'll simply name the variable underscore here to show that we're not going to use it, and then use resharper to bring in a reference to the session that we're going to use. In the endpoint, we'll define a session member variable, so we can hold on to this session, as we'll be using it later. And then in the onOpen, we'll have this dot session equals session. We also need to keep a collection of all the connected clients so that we can send messages to all of those clients. When the client opens a connection, this endpoint class, this chat endpoint class, will represent that open client. So we need to maintain a collection of these chat endpoint classes, one for each open client. And that will be held in a static collection. So again, within chat endpoint, we can have static, and the collection we have will be a list of chat endpoint instances. We'll call this clients, and we'll set this equal to a new copy on write array list.